We're back with our panel. Rich Lowry is the editor of the National Review and also a Fox News contributor. Excuse me. Jeffrey Goldberg writes for Bloomberg View and The Atlantic. Peter Baker is the White House correspondent for the New York Times. And we're also joined by CBS News State Department correspondent Margaret Brennan. And I begin there. What's the latest?
Well, Charlie, Secretary Kerry spoke yesterday, the day before, with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. They're still not agreeing to sit down and talk directly to the Ukrainians. And that is where the bulk of the diplomatic efforts are being focused right now. Just talk to each other, whether it's directly or through an intermediary. So they believe that they're chipping away at this, but there's really been no change to the Russian position in terms of agreeing to sit down. When we were in Paris on Thursday and on Wednesday with Secretary Kerry, I mean, Sergei Lavrov pretended not to even know who the Ukrainian foreign minister was, despite the fact he had arrived in the city on the Secretary of State's plane. So nothing's changing there. The facts on the ground have not changed, and we've actually seen these international monitors being blocked from going into Crimea.
And that was the point that Secretary Baker was trying to make in terms of talking to the Ukrainians. There is also Crimea right now. Yeah. Bob Gates, former Secretary of Defense, said Crimea is lost.
Yeah.
How does the administration see Crimea?
Well, look, their first priority since this has happened is to try to prevent it from spreading, right? They recognize that actually reversing Putin's hold over Crimea is not something that's going to happen in the immediate short term. That the first priority was preventing him from going on further into the rest of eastern Ukraine and creating basically a split country. Whether or not they can live with Crimea as sort of either an annexed part or an enclave is unclear, but that's what the Russian playbook has been before. They've done this in Georgia, they've done this in other parts of the former Soviet Union.
I would love to have been in on the phone conversations.
Yeah.
What are they saying to each other?
They've talked President Obama, President Putin have talked for an hour at a time, an hour and a half at a time. Some of that obviously is taken up by translation, so that cuts off the actual amount of conversation. But there's a lot of, I think, Putin talking about his grievances, trying to explain how he sees Crimea, how he sees the new Ukrainian government as illegitimate, a product of Western interference. And President Obama, I think, is pushing back on that, but trying to get him to agree to some sort of off-ramp. That's the phrase he uses, off-ramp. But of course, President Putin is hitting the accelerator. He's not taking the off-ramp.
Is there any sense of how far the administration is prepared to go?
They tried to take it kind of slow at first. They put on some modest sanctions, not very many at this point, with the idea that they can point to the Russians and say, we're going to go much further if you don't reverse course. But there doesn't seem to be any sign that that's having an impact.
You've been writing about this. Tell me where you think the president has not done enough.
Yeah, well, I think the Russians would have gone into Crimea probably regardless. But when the President of the United States is not respected or feared around the world, it does create a more permissive environment. And I think some of the statements have been kind of otherworldly. John Kerry and others saying these are 19th and 20th century acts, as though the problem Putin has is he can't read the calendar correctly, and raw power politics is a thing of the past. Whereas if this stands, it will be the second time in 6 years that Russia has effectively changed international boundaries by force of arms. Now, I think some of the policy steps that the administration has taken the last week or so are in the right direction, but we need more, and we need to persist.
More sanctions, more things like that, or more movement of troops, or what?
Sanctions, I think, are key, especially when it comes to the corrupt elite in Russia, and that's almost a redundancy. All these people in the government and people around them are very rich. They love to park their assets over here in the West because all of them need a so-called off-ramp, to coin a phrase, if things bounce the wrong way for them in Russia. So if you cut them off from here and, importantly, from Europe, which might be a little easier said than done, that will hurt.
Syria, do you think this has had an impact in terms of Syria while the president is focused with Russia and on Ukraine and not on trying to get something done in Syria?
Well, I mean, Syria is in a terrible spot, but I think there's actually a strange thing going on that people haven't noticed yet, which is that I sense that the administration is doing more now to help the rebels, especially on the southern front out of Jordan, than they previously were. Some of the statements coming out about Syria have been from sort of, let's say, more muscular. There's obviously been the Director of National Intelligence who a couple of weeks ago talked about Syria as a direct national security threat to the United States. The Deputy Secretary of State has talked about this as a national security threat. I'm wondering if the president has been slowly dissuaded by the behavior of Assad, by the behavior of Khamenei, and the behavior now of Putin, into thinking that anything is discussable, or that we can talk through any problem. And I'm wondering if we're moving into a phase that Jimmy Carter moved in after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, where he said, okay, enough with the belief that I can just reason with everyone. I don't know if we're there yet, but I think they're shifting in that direction a little bit.
Anybody think that's a possibility?
Well, you are seeing a more robust arming and effort in the south of Syria, but I think broadly speaking, you know, the U.S. was embarrassed after that last round of peace talks that Russia just didn't deliver the regime in the way that, in many ways, they had estimated they'd be able to.
They fell behind the schedule.
They fell behind the schedule on the CW. They fell behind at the peace talks by, yes, they brought the Syrians to the table, but they didn't negotiate anything when they got there. And so I think that has led to a reevaluation of some of the policy. Politically, though, I think it is embarrassing and makes the administration sensitive to this public scrutiny that has erupted around Ukraine and this question of whether we should be reliant on the Russians in a diplomatic sense to deliver anything at this point.
The sense that I get, Charlie, real quick on this is that, you know, the president has always had a special carve out for North Korea. The North Koreans are crazy. Everyone else I can deal with. I have a feeling, based on some conversations around the administration, that they're moving into a different understanding of Putin. Not as crazy necessarily, but as a guy who can't be reasoned with, and that's going to have broad policy implications.
Reasoned with because he's obsessed by the idea of restoring Russia's grandeur?
Right, because in other words, just like the Iranians or the Syrians, they just have different goals, and the goals are not compatible, and they can't be worked out. Everything is about bringing everything to the table. Well, you know, they're two different tables at a certain point.
This, you know, George W. Bush didn't exactly have a cold-eyed, realistic view of Vladimir Putin right at the beginning, but all you needed to know happened in Georgia in 2008 when Russia invades. A little more ambiguous case than this one, but Reset was about basically saying to the Russians, all is forgotten and forgiven over that, and let's work together. And we got really nothing of substance from it, because the Russians will help us, and this goes to Jeffrey's point, exactly to the extent it is in their own interest and no further. They're happy to have us fight Islamic radicals in Afghanistan because that's a common enemy. They're happy to forge a face-saving deal for the president over Syria's chemical weapons so long as they can further buttress that regime and help it crush its own people. With all due respect to Secretary Baker, they're happy to sign the New START nuclear treaty, which was a laughably bad deal for the United States.
The question of the Crimea is interesting, what's happening there today. And you hear Gates saying, Secretary Gates said it's lost. Right. You have other people suggesting we've got to use more force, more pressure on Putin. What's the risk here of a renewed Cold War?
Well, I mean, we ought to be careful about overstating things, but I think obviously it's a risk of a very bad period of hostility. You heard William Hague, the British Foreign Secretary today, say that if Putin were to move into eastern Ukraine, that there would be a real chance of a real shooting conflict, he said, which is not something a real hot war, and it's hard to imagine, but it's certainly plausible these days. And it's important to remember that Ukraine is important to Russia in a way that we don't fully understand here. I mean, it's not just simply another country. This is part of Russia's history, its culture, its sense of identity, and we have to understand that in order to deal with it.
And the diplomatic point is, how do you make them understand you understand that?
Right.
And at the same time, serve your own interests, that the Ukrainians should be able to decide their own future.
Right, exactly. Yeah. People in Crimea might actually want to be part of Russia, but can they do it at the point of a gun, in effect? Can you have a fair referendum with Russian troops there? That's a different beast.
And will the administration continue to be able to encourage the Ukrainians to hold their fire, essentially, and not be provoked? That has been a consistent message. Thank you for your restraint. This could be a lot worse. And I imagine that when the Prime Minister comes here to Washington this week, that's going to be a conversation again, how to prevent this from escalating.
Before we go down the road of, is this the new Cold War? I mean, it's important to remember, in the Cold War, there was a global competition between the United States. I mean, they were in Angola and Nicaragua and across the... Now we're talking about places that are Russian majority, Russian speaking, right up against Russia's border that we're competing about. So Putin is on the back foot still, and this is not about the global Russian empire.
This is not a power equality.
But I don't think anyone is really talking about threatening Russia's legitimate interest in Crimea. It already had some autonomy. No one was talking about kicking them out of that base there. So this is an entirely concocted neo-imperial play for power.
Well, it's a reaction to what he sees in Ukraine as being a threat. So he sees the new government coming in, tossing out Yanukovych as part of a Western conspiracy to move further. It's the next extension of...
that the West had something to do with overthrowing Yanukovych.
Yes, and this is the extension of NATO expanding all the way to where they feel very hemmed in. They feel he is on the back foot in that sense, and he feels quite threatened as a result. There's also a domestic component. This is politics at home. He's never been more popular since 2012 when he came back as president.
I think it's interesting here because we tend to brush aside the financial crisis there, but capitalism in so many ways is the administration's sharpest weapon and tool in this case, they believe, when dealing with Russia when it comes to sanctions, or when they say, look what's happening to their markets right now, and they can't afford Ukraine to implode.
Interesting point, too. Jim Jones made a point about energy. I mean, we do have new weapons at our disposal to use, and if, in fact, they can rally the NATO countries, they have a better and more effective weapon, but people have expressed some misgivings about whether Germany's prepared to do that or not.
We're on a different page than Europe right now. That's the important thing, because they're tied into the Russian economy in a way that we're not.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.